Somewhere in a freezer in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a set of saliva samples is waiting to be read. Somewhere in a spreadsheet at 23andMe, more than 160,000 people have already had their ancestry broken down into fractions of a percent. Somewhere along the Tennessee-Virginia border, a family has spent 2 centuries telling their children a story about where they came from. And somewhere in that story, the DNA and the legend stopped agreeing with each other. Every wave of people who ever came to this country left a signature behind, written into the genomes of their descendants, still readable today. Scientists have now mapped almost all of them. Scandinavians, Germans, Italians, the Spanish colonizers who came first, the Africans who were brought in chains. And when researchers laid every wave side by side, one group didn't behave like an immigrant wave at all. It behaved like something else entirely. This isn't folklore, and it isn't a home DNA kit party trick. This is a peer-reviewed study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, led by geneticist Katarzyna Breik, who conducted the work as part of a postdoctoral fellowship in David Reich's population genetics lab at Harvard Medical School, in partnership with researchers at 23andMe. The dataset behind it is enormous by the standards of human genetics. More than 160,000 people. 160,000 people. That is not a sample. That is close to a census. Harvard historian Henry Louis Gates, Jr., who has spent decades tracing lineage through both archives and genomes, called the work a bridge between hard data and the actual human events that built the country. This wasn't a fringe theory circulating on a forum. It was mainstream population genetics, the same field that reconstructs migrations out of Africa 50,000 years ago, turned instead on the last 400 years of American history. To understand what the researchers found, it helps to think about DNA the way you'd think about a recipe passed down through a family, copied and recopied by hand for generations. Every time someone copies a recipe, they might smudge a word, substitute an ingredient, or add a note in the margin. After enough generations, you can't read the original page anymore, but you can still see traces of everyone who touched it, layered on top of each other. Human ancestry works almost exactly the same way. Every person carries a mixture of genetic notes in the margin from ancestors going back centuries. Geneticists have learned to read those layers using pieces of DNA called ancestry. Informative markers, sections of the genome that differ in measurable statistical ways between populations that lived apart from each other for long stretches of time. It's not magic and it's not guesswork. It's pattern recognition on a genomic scale run across a data set larger than the population of many small countries. The first thing the researchers confirmed is something most Americans already sense but rarely see quantified. This country's regional identities are written into its DNA, almost like a map you could redraw, using genetic data alone instead of state lines. Take Minnesota and the Dakotas. Scandinavian ancestry shows up in trace amounts almost everywhere in the country, 1% here, 0.5% there. But in Minnesota and the Dakotas, it jumps to roughly 10% of the average European American genome, a fingerprint left behind by the massive wave of Norwegian and Swedish immigration into the upper Midwest in the late 1800s. You can still see, in the DNA of people living there today, the exact place their great-great-grandparents got off the boat and decided to stay. Here's the part that surprises people who assume regional ancestry is mostly folklore. It isn't. It's measurable, it's consistent, and it lines up almost perfectly with the historical immigration records. Then there's the Spanish wave, the oldest one the study could still detect clearly, dating back to early colonization in places like Florida, Texas, and the Southwest, centuries before Ellis Island existed. That wave shows up today as a distinct signature in the ancestry of many Latino Americans, LSI, hired on top of indigenous and, in many cases, African ancestry, a genetic record of colonization, mixture, and forced relocation that stretches back to the 16th century. The researchers were also able to trace the genetic fingerprint of the forced displacement of Native American populations within the U.S., a history usually told through treaties and maps, now visible instead in allele frequencies. Each of these waves, on its own, behaves the way you'd expect an immigration wave to behave. People arrive from somewhere specific, they settle somewhere specific, and centuries later their descendants still carry a detectable trace of that origin point, concentrated in the regions where their ancestors landed. There's a similar signature sitting inside the wave most people picture first when they hear the phrase American immigration. Ellis Island, roughly 1892 through the 1920s, when millions of Italians, Irish, and Eastern European Jews arrived through New York Harbor and scattered into cities up and down the East Coast. The Bryce study wasn't built to trace every single European subgroup with the same precision as the Scandinavian signal, but it confirmed the underlying principle at a broader scale. Regional differences in European ancestry across the United States consistently tracked the documented waves of immigration from different parts of Europe, concentrated in the cities and regions where each group actually settled. The Italian and Eastern European signature is strongest today in exactly the corridor you'd expect. The urban Northeast, a genetic echo of tenement neighborhoods and steamship manifests more than a century old. None of this required guesswork. It required comparing a documented historical record against a genomic one and watching the two line up. Now here's where it gets personal, and where the data started overturning a few assumptions about race and identity in America. The researchers found that a striking number of people who currently identify as white carry African ancestry they likely don't know about. About 4% of self-identified white Americans in the study carried at least 1% African ancestry, a genetic signature usually inherited from an ancestor 5 to 10 generations back, well before living memory, often invisible in family stories that were deliberately rewritten or simply forgotten. The study also found something almost poetic about where the line gets drawn. People with up to roughly 28% African ancestry were statistically more likely to describe themselves as European American, while people above roughly 30% were more likely to identify as African American. That's not biology deciding identity. That's history, law, and social pressure deciding it, and the DNA just happened to be sitting there quietly, keeping score the whole time. If you're keeping track of everything so far, the DNA of everyday Americans lines up, wave by wave, with the documented history of who came here and when. Scandinavians in the upper Midwest, Spanish colonization stretching back 400 years, forced relocation of native populations, hidden African ancestry sitting undetected inside white family trees for generations. Every wave checks out. Every wave, so far, tells a story the historical record already predicted, and that consistency is exactly what makes what happened next so strange. Because when researchers turned their instruments toward a small, specific population in the Appalachian Mountains, the genetics refused to match the story that population had been telling about itself for 200 years. That population is known as the Melungeons, a group of families concentrated for generations along the Tennessee-Virginia border, people with dark hair, olive or brown skin, and a set of surnames, Goins, Collins, Gibson, Bunch, Mullins, that show up again and again in historical records going back to the 1700s. Early explorers and settlers moving into the mountains describe finding these families already living there in permanent cabins with glass windows, speaking English, sometimes owning land, decades before large-scale European settlement was supposed to have reached that far into the Appalachian interior. For most of American history, nobody quite knew what to call them, and the community itself offered an answer. They weren't black, they weren't white in the ordinary sense, and they weren't Native American either. They were, according to generations of oral tradition, descendants of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors or Mediterranean traders, or, in one persistent 20th century version of the story, Ottoman Turks who had somehow made their way into the Appalachian interior centuries before anyone else got there. In the next part of this, we go straight into the DNA itself, because in 2012, someone finally tested it. The study, published in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, and led by researcher Roberta Estes, working with a team that included several members of the Melungeon community itself, analyzed Y chromosome DNA, passed down father to son, and mitochondrial DNA, passed down mother to child, across dozens of families carrying the historic Melungeon surnames. What makes this so different from the previous waves is the shape of the answer it produced. The male lines, the Y chromosome data, showed sub-Saharan African origins. The female lines, the mitochondrial data, showed Northern or Central European origins. There was no meaningful trace of Portuguese ancestry, no meaningful trace of Mediterranean or Turkish origin, no dominant thread of Native American ancestry either, though some later, broader autosomal studies would go on to detect small amounts of Native American admixture in parts of the community. The core finding, the one that made headlines, was blunt. The Melungeons descended from unions between African men and European women, almost certainly beginning in colonial Virginia in the 1600s, before slavery had hardened into the rigid, race-based legal system it would later become. That finding didn't fit, and it's worth sitting with exactly why. Every other wave in this story is structurally an immigration story, a population living somewhere else, crossing an ocean or a border, arriving and settling. The Melungeons weren't that. There was no boat from Lisbon. There was no crossing from Anatolia. Their origin wasn't a wave arriving from outside the country's borders at all. It was something that happened inside those borders in the earliest, messiest years of colonial Virginia, when African and European indentured servants sometimes lived, worked, and had children together under conditions the later slave system would make almost unthinkable. As racial laws hardened through the late 1600s and 1700s, mixed-race families like these had powerful incentive to describe themselves as something else, anything else, that wouldn't put them on the wrong side of laws increasingly built around a strict black and white racial line. Portuguese wasn't a random invention. It was a strategic survival identity. a way to be legally and socially white adjacent while explaining away a complexion that didn't quite match the story. Lead researcher Roberta Estes told reporters after the study's release that the reaction from within the community was intense. A whole lot of people were upset, she said, because they had genuinely believed for generations that they were Portuguese. Or Native American, something more romantic and more distant than the truth the DNA delivered. That reaction alone tells you something the pure genetics can't. These weren't just abstract data points on a chart. These were real families whose sense of who they were, passed down at kitchen tables for 200 years, ran headlong into a lab result they hadn't asked for and, in some cases, didn't want. Here's the part worth pausing on before going further, because it's easy to hear. Sub-Saharan African men and European women in colonial Virginia, and assume the story is simple. It isn't. Later, more extensive genetic surveys of Melungeon-descended families, run using broader autosomal panels rather than just Y chromosome and mitochondrial lines, found the community to be far more genetically diverse than the original 2012 study suggested, with some families showing elevated Jewish, Middle Eastern, and Native American genetic signals alongside the African and European core, and a minority showing no detectable sub-Saharan African ancestry at all. In other words, Melungeon was never one bloodline. It was a social label applied to a cluster of families who happened to share a regional identity and a set of surnames, and whose individual genetic histories, once you actually looked, turned out to be almost as varied as the wider American population the study had just spent pages describing. That's roughly where we are, 2/3 of the way through this, so it's worth restacking what the data has actually shown. Scandinavian settlers left a measurable signature in the upper Midwest. Spanish colonization left one across the Southwest in Florida, centuries before anyone thinks of as immigration in the modern sense. Roughly 4% of white Americans carry African ancestry most of them don't know about. And one Appalachian population, mythologized for 2 centuries as Mediterranean or Ottoman in origin, turned out to be neither. A domestic mixture born inside the colony, not a wave that arrived from outside it. If you've made it this far, and you're the kind of person who likes finding the thread other people miss, this next part is exactly why the subscribe button exists. There's a lot more of this hiding in plain sight in the archive. There's also a question worth sitting with here. Why did it take DNA to settle this, when the oral history had been passed down for 200 years? Part of the answer is that oral history, however sincerely believed, isn't neutral. It's shaped by whatever story was survival at the time it formed, and in the case of families with African ancestry living under an increasingly rigid racial caste system in 18th and 19th century Virginia and Tennessee, Portuguese was infinitely more survivable than the truth. And the DNA doesn't carry that same pressure. It doesn't care what was legal to say out loud in 1830. It just carries the actual biological record, indifferent to the politics layered on top of it generations later. That's what makes it such a strange kind of evidence, more honest than memory, but also more disruptive to it. Now, here's the part that connects this back to everything that came before it. The broader Bryce study, the one covering more than 160,000 people, wasn't just cataloging separate, tidy waves that never touched each other. It was documenting what the researchers themselves called pervasive mixed ancestry across every group studied, African Americans, Latinos, and European Americans alike, along with what they described as asymmetrical male and female ancestry contributions, meaning the men and women who founded these mixed lineages often came from different populations. Exactly the pattern seen at a smaller, more concentrated scale in the Melungeon families. The difference is really just intensity and visibility. Most Americans carry a diluted, generations-old version of exactly the kind of mixture the Melungeons carry in a more concentrated, more socially conspicuous form. The Melungeons aren't a genetic anomaly. They're what happens when that same universal American pattern gets compressed into a small, tight-knit community that couldn't quietly disappear into the statistical background the way most mixed ancestry eventually does. Before going any further, it's worth being completely honest about what this kind of evidence can and can't tell you, because this is exactly the point where a lot of DNA reporting overpromises. And this is the part of the video that isn't trying to sell you a shocking twist. Nobody tested a specific colonial-era Melungeon ancestor directly. There's no 18th century skeleton in a lab, no named individual whose remains were sequenced and matched to a documented person. What these studies actually measure is population-level ancestry, statistical patterns across living descendants' genomes compared against reference populations, used to infer where large chunks of shared genetic material most likely came from. That is powerful evidence, but it is not the same thing as individual-level proof about any single historical person, and it never claims to be. The Bryce study, likewise, isn't naming individual immigrants who stepped off individual ships. It's describing statistical signatures across populations of tens of thousands of living people, And those signatures can shift and sharpen as datasets grow and methods improve. The 2012 Melungeon study itself has been complicated by later, broader genetic surveys, which is exactly what should happen in good science. Not certainty carved in stone, but a picture that gets more detailed and sometimes more complicated with better data. To be clear, nobody in this field is claiming to have found the one true Melungeon ancestor hiding in a Virginia churchyard. What they found is a strong, repeatedly confirmed pattern across many families, which is a different, more honest kind of claim. It's also worth remembering that doesn't fit isn't the same as doesn't count. The Melungeon families are just as American, just as rooted in this country's founding centuries, as any Scandinavian farmer in Minnesota, or any Sicilian family stepping off a ship in New York Harbor. What makes their story different isn't the DNA itself. Mixed African and European ancestry from the colonial era shows up, in smaller doses, throughout huge portions of the southern and Appalachian population, Melungeon labeled or not. What makes the Melungeon case remarkable is that a specific named community built an entire alternate identity on top of that. Ancestry, and held onto it for 2 centuries, long enough for the invented version to feel more real than the biology underneath it. That's not a flaw in the science. That's the science doing exactly what it's supposed to do, separating the story people needed to tell from the history that actually happened. And that honesty matters, because the story underneath all of this was never really about Portuguese sailors, or Ottoman Turks, or the exact percentage in anyone's ancestry composition. It was about what people are willing to believe about themselves, and why, and what happens when the evidence stops cooperating with the story. Every wave mapped in this research, Scandinavian, Spanish, African, Native American, tells you something about arrival, about people crossing water or crossing borders and leaving a trace behind in their children's children. The Melungeon story tells you something different. It tells you that not every American mystery is about who came from somewhere else. Some of them are about what happened right here, in the earliest, least documented years of the country, between people the law hadn't yet decided how to categorize. The DNA didn't invent a new origin story, it just refused to let an old, more comfortable one stand unchallenged. So when you think about your own family's version of where you came from, the version told at holidays, half documented, half legend, it's worth asking which parts of that story survived because they were true, and which parts survived because at some point in some year, they were simply easier to say out loud than the alternative. The Melungeons didn't choose to become a genetic mystery. They chose, generation after generation, the version of their own history that let them keep their land, their safety, and their place in a country that was often actively hostile to the truth. The DNA didn't judge that choice. It just eventually told the difference. Tell me in the comments which part stuck with you more. The 4% of white Americans carrying hidden African ancestry they've never known about, or the Melungeon families who spent 2 centuries insisting they were Portuguese before the science said otherwise.